Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hey, nonprofit friends, welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host today, and I bring back a familiar face to a Modern Nonprofit podcast. Paul, it doesn't happen often, but every once in a while we bring on a guest for the second time, because the first time we often said this could be a whole nother episode. This can be a whole nother episode. I'm pretty notorious for saying that, and sometimes I just forget to go back and do it. But last time we connected, we were just chatting about fundraising, because you are a executive fundraising coach with a company called Auxilia. And we got to talking about, while we were there to talk about fundraising, we were also just starting to talk about sometimes the clash between fundraising and finance and the need for collaboration to really create a sustainable, well-ran organization. And you obviously working on the fundraising side, and obviously me as a CPA working on the finance side. We have both so many stories of how it's been successful or maybe not successful. And this was kind of an idea that we had to do another episode to dive a little bit deeper into that conversation, because I know I've struggled with it, you've struggled with it. I think anybody that's worked in the nonprofit leadership space for any period of time has had to deal with some of the tension between these two functions. So that's what we're here to do, to talk about today, Paul. Thank you again for coming on and sharing your experiences and breathing some humor into the chaos. So thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me back. I like to be, a party guest that people want to have come back, either because I bring something to the table, or I bring a nice gift, or maybe I say something kooky that's just kooky enough to be like, yeah, that kind of livens it up. So, and you're absolutely right. This is a topic that really it seems to be one of those things that is just ongoing, and everyone seems to struggle with it. And there doesn't need to be that struggle, right? It's not. And so I'm very excited to talk in a little bit more depth about this topic, especially with you, given your background as a CPA. I mean, so many I've worked with some wonderful CPAs, but it's like they see CPA, like they see things through their lens, and that is it. And it's like, well, no, there's more, right? There's more to this, and there should be more to this, to, as you said, ensure that nonprofit organizations are able to thrive.
Completely agree. So let's start with, I think, the first source of tension, maybe. There's many, but if we have to pick one, let's start with the budget. Okay, so in my experience, the budget, and let's just define the budget in a couple different ways for those that are maybe not new to like leadership or whatever. So the budget could be the organizational wide budget that's put together on an annual basis, right? And then there's also smaller budgets. Think about grant budgets, program budget, things that you need as a tool to, fundraise on a restricted grant or something like this. So for purposes of this conversation, let's talk about kind of an organizational wide budget. And here's something, maybe we can tee up this conversation like, well, I'll tell my version of the story and you tell your version of the story, right? With these different things. So for the budget, where I think organizations that are really, really effectively ran, the budget is a collaborative process, meaning that the key players, think about your executive leadership, they all have influence in the budget making process. And that's like the gold standard for me and the clients that I work with, that we get to that point with all the leadership. Now, how it happens oftentimes in common practice, this is my version of the story, that the accountant, for especially smaller organizations, will essentially own all of the budget. They will go through all the detail, they will put the budget together, And, it's kind of sometimes not even shared with program leaders, fundraisers, et cetera. It's certainly not lifted up in conversation is sort of, getting buy-in from everyone. You're not getting assumptions from people. The accountant is not asking those that are charged with these different functions for their assumptions or expectations, or defining whatever resources they need for the year to get their objectives met, right? So it's just kind of sitting in a silo, making the budget as it is. And that's not my preferred way because for all the reasons that I already mentioned. And I will say I have been actually a CFO of a nonprofit, and I've been tasked over different times, and then and now, as a kind of a quasi consultant that works as an outsourced CFO for hundreds of nonprofits. Some organizations prefer that because it's just like secretive and we can't, share all the things with the people. And I've had to put a budget together for which I have little information to go off of. And where it's really frustrating, insert fundraising, is that I have to either blindly accept a fundraising number or, oh, we're just going to have 3% more than we did last year, or 5% more, 10%, or something, plug, or it's a plug number. Oh, we have a deficit of $2 million. Well, we'll just put that into fundraising and we'll figure out a way to fundraise that dollar amount, right?
Right.
And that's always been extremely frustrating for me as the accountant, not just in the budget creation process, but all throughout the year when the board of the finance committee, Tasha, why are we behind budget? Why are we not meeting our budget? Why are we not fundraising? Why are we behind in this grant or this corporate donation? Blah, 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 blah. So, and that's crazy frustrating for me as the finance person. And I don't necessarily blame the fundraising person in that organization. Of course, it's the whole culture of how it's created. So the
Right.
question is, who owns the budget? Who should be involved? And I'd love to hear your perspective as the fundraiser, what your preference is and your frustrations around this process.
Well, so no, the ultimately I think the board owns the budget, right? They ultimately have the
So,
fiscal responsibility to ensure that the organization has the resources needed to fulfill its mission on both an annual basis, but also thinking more long term, right? Do we have the necessary reserves to ensure that our organization can continue to grow, thrive if there's a challenge or an opportunity that we are able to proactively take action around that, right? So that ultimately, that's who owns, in theory, owns the budget. But let's talk on a practical level. The leadership team owns the budget. The
mhm.
program staff owns the budget, which I'm all for using 10 words when three will do. The short answer is everyone owns the budget
Mhm.
because everyone needs to understand not just what are we spending money on to fulfill our mission, because you have to spend money to fulfill your mission. I mean, I'm sorry,
Mhm.
this is not, we don't live in the magical realm of rainbows and money pooping unicorns, right? That it's just
Mhm.
like, oh, it's all going to be fine, right? And blah,
Mhm.
blah. You have to understand, so everyone needs to understand and participate in define, saying this is what we need to spend money on to fulfill our mission effectively.
Mhm.
Likewise, everyone needs to understand where money is coming from, not just so that people understand how much money potentially they have to spend for the year on their program, but even more importantly, so that they understand
Mhm.
that they have a part to play in potentially in the identification of potential resources, in
Mhm.
engagement with potential donors, maybe not soliciting funds, and because I'm not in favor of staff having to go out and solicit funds directly unless that is their job,
Right.
right? I mean, I love having program staff meet with donors or on-site visits because they can really add color and illustration to why a program is impactful, but I would never ask them to go out and raise money,
Right.
right? Just on their, themselves. I
Sure.
want them to be focused on what they do well, which is program delivery.
Mhm.
But program staff are also really phenomenal at stewardship right? Talking about the impact of a gift and impact of investment. And what is maddening to me is that organizations and organizations of all size, I mean, we can't just lay this at the, at small, inexperienced organizations, although I think it is brought into greater relief in small organizations because it's harder to hide things, right? But at organizations of all size, they engage in exactly what you were just talking about, this like secretive backroom approach to budgeting. And all of a sudden, here's the budget. And okay, fundraising staff, you need to now raise 10, 15, 20 more percent in overall. And oh, we want you to increase the grant line by some, wacko number, even though the organization has little history of traction in that category, right? So I don't understand it.
Right.
Because why? If you claim to be interested in being a strong collaborative leader, why would you hide a core document from the people who are in charge, person or people who now will be tasked with identifying the resources necessary, with engaging potential supporters to then secure those resources, right? I mean, my social feed is littered with desperate pleas from people who have been handed a budget,
right,
and say, go do this. Now, of course, if you come onto a staff like mid-year, well, you're stuck with that budget.
Sure,
right?
sure.
I mean, you have to you can do your best. Now, you can also say it's like, look, this is just not going to happen, right? But why, it's crazy that leadership would put, and this is where I think finance and development need to be collaborative partners, right? So what I often see is, and I've experienced this, where an executive director or CEO will just say, okay, make the budget, and this is what I want, right? As if, they wave a wand and then suddenly, as if by magic, it is going to be created. And, the finance person is like looking at them, but we need more data.
Yeah.
And no, just get it done. And so now, the finance person has been put in this position, this awkward position of exactly what you say, trying to blindly, on the revenue side, I think finance people really understand the expense side.
Right.
And so, they know the expenses, they have that down, but it's that revenue side where now you have to make blind assumptions, and then you hand it over to a fundraiser, and the fundraising person is like, what the what?
Right, right.
This is the first place where finance and development need to be strong collaborative allies to then go back to that leadership, whether it's an ED, a CEO, the board, finance committee, and say, no, we can't do this way.
Right.
And here's why. Not that, no, we won't do it, right? I'm not saying that. It's we cannot engage in magical thinking to create this budget. Here are, from the finance side, here are the expenses that we've had over the last couple of years.
Right.
So, we need to escalate that some amount, right? For cost of living adjustments, for merit raises, just because things are more expensive, whatever, right?
Sure.
Whatever the formulas are to reasonably, right, to reasonably conduct business. And then, on the fundraising side, it's like, this is what the trends are over the last couple of years. So no, we are not going to program in $2 million in grants because you think that Mackenzie Scott is going to give us money, right? It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well,
So
I laugh because that's like the very optimistic thinking. We're just gonna get this new federal grant that hasn't even been awarded yet. And I'm thinking, okay, but like,
what?
That's not real
Right,
yet. So
right.
this
And
happens all the
it's
time.
yes, and the likelihood that it will happen is very low. I mean, when we look at the grant marketplace, grants are in 2023, grants were only 19% of all money given
Hmm.
away in the United States. It has been, is, and will continue to be a hyper competitive
Right,
marketplace.
right, right.
So, so now, you have this magical budget just like created
Hmm.
for like foisted. I mean, I would go so far as to say it's been foisted upon people.
Hmm.
And then that sets up, it's like this weird sort of contest. Then it becomes a contest of like of wills,
Hmm.
right? Where every month the finance committee is looking at the finance person saying, because the organization is behind, the finance
Hmm.
person is like, well, why are you looking at me?
Right,
And
right,
then everyone looks at the fundraiser, and the fundraiser is like, you gave me a shit budget,
right, right,
like that is based on not on reality.
right.
And then it's like back and forth. And now, how many times have you had to like repeatedly go into a fundraiser's office or space to say, where's the money? Where's the money? Where's
Right,
the money?
right, right.
Right? I mean, that is
Yeah.
that is a fast way. That is an easy and fast way to make enemies.
And I want to talk more about like the revenue side because I agree with you. I mean, the expenses are usually pretty predictable within reason. Like those are
Right.
pretty, I mean, really most organizations somewhere between 60 and 80% of their total like budget is going to be related to personnel cost. And we
Right.
usually know what those are going to be. And so for the most part, the budget is what it is on the expense side. On the revenue side, I want to say one more thing. I think frustrating for the finance team, so team finance here, that I think creates a sense of um, frustration. Like I said, is let's say it's somewhere in the middle where I've seen more often than not. It's not so much the account is sitting in their like back office coming up with the budget. It's like mostly doing that, but they'll ask for fundraising numbers, like total
Hmm.
number per line item. So how much in total individuals, how much in total grants, whatever. And I've seen this so often where there's not any sort of real analysis or inventory of who's actually giving, what are the trends? You kind of mentioned that earlier, that I've seen fundraising folks just know that they have to increase year over year what they raise. And so rather than really having the honest conversations with the CEO or whoever about, hey, well, we had this gift that was a 3-year commitment. We're losing that fund, whatever the conversations are, whatever the nuances, having an actual honest conversation and some sort of analysis or an inventory through some sort of gift table or kind of projections. Like, let's actually put some names to some of these numbers and actually feel that we have done the due diligence to make sure that these numbers are right. Because, like I said, in the past, I've got numbers like, well, we're just going to increase individuals by 10%. We're going to increase grants by like 50%, even though we have no history.
Right.
Like it's just like literally pulled out of the sky or something.
Right.
And then, so to
Right.
your point, going back to what you're saying earlier, then it's like, all right, I got to go in front of the board. And they're like, well, why are these numbers, why are we off budget? I'm like, kind of because these numbers were garbage because they had to come up with something. And in the absence of a culture that allows a little bit of pushback or at least just some conversation around, hey, CEO, we lost a significant funding or we've made the decision to forego this event or whatever, I'm making whatever up. That's a loss of funding and I'm not sure we're gonna be able to make that up this year. And so we need to be prepared to go to the board and say, we're actually going to fundraise less this year or whatever. That conversation says no one ever, we're going to fundraise less, even if something
Right.
significant did happen. And so that's another piece of the budget, I think, creation that I see more often than not, that the finance person kind of inherits bits and pieces of information without a lot of detail and a whole lot of like actual assumptions that go into it. And then so everybody's just kind of looking around when the questions come and pointing fingers and all that stuff.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think that we have seen this exact, what you have described, exactly play out over the last few years because organizations that got money during the pandemic were like, back the Brinks truck up, all this money is coming in. And then the organizations that have a culture of collaboration and of thoughtful approach to planning and implementation across the board said, this is really great money. We are super thankful for it, but we are not going to assume anything about it, right? Those organizations, then turned around and said, okay, this is how we're going. And then again, this is where, right? Let's combine team finance, team development. Let's make a super team called team resource, where finance, right? They're tracking it closely. Development is talking about the nuance of where have these gifts come from? Are these new gifts? Are these increased gifts? Okay, this is what we're going to do to continue, right? To draw people closer. So to be able to renew a gift or continue like that, someone increase their giving, can we keep them at that level or maybe increase that level? So let's do the stewardship work necessary to bring nuance and detail to future budgeting. And then, the finance person can say, okay, yes, these numbers, I understand the assumptions. I understand that where these numbers are coming from. Okay, we can line this up. Everything, good. This is something that we can all work on and toward and feel comfortable and confident with it. Organizations that just got like a bunch of money, and this is where I think most of them fall, is they're like, this is our new reality and we're just going to stay there and who knows what's going to happen, but it's going to happen. And then when it doesn't, because we all know that donor retention is, most organizations do that really poorly. Well, now the finance person immediately has to start looking at, okay, where can we cut to maintain our cash flow? The development person is like, getting slapped around, like, why didn't this gift renew? What about this? What about that? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Whatever. When if everyone had been willing to have an honest conversation, which requires everyone, all of the key players being at the table. I can't tell you the number of organizations that I have seen where the development director or whoever is in charge of development is left out of these conversations. They're not even invited to the conversation, and they're the one that has the most knowledge, right? The most ready knowledge. And yet they're completely ignored until 6 months into the year and things are way behind. And it's like, well, you haven't done your job well enough, right? You have not created magic. So you're out. We'll find someone else.
Sure.
And it's just, I think it really comes down to, you've mentioned this a couple of times, it comes down to culture. And does the organization have a culture of openness and collaboration where you can have these kinds of open and honest conversations? It's not, right? I'm not critiquing, a finance person asking me about, okay, what makes up individual giving. I do not take as a critique. I need to be prepared to speak with confidence and in detail about what we're doing. If I have said we're going to increase the individual line, I need to be able to demonstrate that we have the pipeline to get there.
The ability to do that, yeah.
Exactly. A culture of denial, of magical thinking, of I'm the CEO or I'm the board, and so we're right, and our word is what it is. Then those are the organizations that get into deep trouble. It's not that organizations that have a culture of collaboration don't get into trouble. They do. But then they're able to navigate out of that. Right? the finance committee or the board is willing to hear, no, we are keeping the revenue budget flat
Hmm.
this year,
Right.
and this is why. Right? I've
Hmm.
had that conversation with boards. I've had that conversation with finance people. And it's not because I don't want to keep it flat because I'm lazy or,
Right.
I have a queue of Red Panda videos to watch and I need to do that. It's that the pipeline or external forces are dictating that to keep it flat is a smarter play in the short term than it is to make, these increases that have no basis in reality.
Hmm. Speaking of income, like let's talk too about this idea where I've also seen some tension around how or who decides how gifts are spent, right? So if you're a
Yes.
fundraiser and you got a grant for, say, $10,000 for purple pens or something, I don't know, whatever the restrictions are, where have you seen tension like that come into the organizations you've worked with? Like who decides how these gifts are spent, and where have you seen people try to present authority over those decisions when they really don't?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was just thinking about this because I was having a conversation recently and I saw some other messages on this very topic. To me, yes, I understand that there are accounting rules,
Hmm.
right? And there are generally accepted practices related to financial management. And
Hmm.
I'm all for those.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Because that's what creates a healthy, sustainable, or scalable organization.
Right.
From a fundraising perspective, however, um, the rules of donors are not thinking about the rules of accounting.
Sure.
They are most concerned, and so therefore I am most concerned with what is the intent of their gift.
Right. Right.
Have they said, I want my gift to be spent on X?
Hmm.
As the internal then advocate for that donor,
Hmm.
when I am talking to the finance person about how to code a gift, my expectation is that the finance person is going to say, okay, I got it. This is how we are going to code it in the books
Hmm.
so that it aligns with what the intent of the donor is. Now,
Sure.
let's say it's easier to be collaborative when it is a restricted individual gift or grant most often, and it is for a particular program. The
Right.
solicit has been, okay, we want you to invest $10,000 in after school music.
Hmm.
Donor says yes. Okay, that's coded to the after school music program.
Right.
Very straightforward.
Right. Right.
And the rules, right? That's where, the rules and intention align
Right.
really well.
Hmm.
I often have, nonprofit finance people have told me that gifts need to be coded a certain way because that's what the rules are. And I'm like, that is not the
Hmm.
intent of the donor. And that is what we must honor. So let's figure out how to honor that intention
Right.
within the rules that are set for the organization. Because at the end of the day, it is me,
Hmm.
not the finance person. It is
Right.
me who has to go back to that donor to say, this is how we have utilized your investment.
Right. Right.
Um, so I think though the most notorious perpetrators uh, of not doing what donors intend are EDs and CEOs. They see a gift
Mm.
come in, they see a gap, right? They see a
Hmm.
gap in the budget and they're like, let's
Right.
code it there.
Right. Right.
And again, that is like the moment that is the moment where finance and development need to be collaborative allies and
Mhm.
say, no, this is how, based on the donor intention, this is how this gift needs to be coded. Too often, the finance person just defaults to what the CEO or the ED wants to do, and it
Mhm.
leaves the development person like hanging out on their own.
Mhm.
And, because you have this culture of not sharing information, people not understanding,
Right.
right, the detail or the nuance, then it's this, wait a second, it's a mess.
Exactly. Let me add, like I could probably give like a little bit of an example of what I think you're describing on, the finance side. So you had talked about sharing information, and let's say, let's use the example that, a fundraising professional wrote a grant for $10,000 for some program supplies. And the way that the grant was written was pretty generic. Just said program supplies for this particular program, whatever. And by the way, we spend a lot of money on program supplies for that program, right? So, no problem spending that money. And sometimes where like the financial side has been frustrating, if that restriction in no way has been communicated to finance, like, oh, this is actually for, an ADA accessible, playground piece of equipment. I'm making something up, very specific,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
they have a very specific desire to provide our school with this particular piece of equipment. If that's never communicated to the finance person, then it's never tracked accordingly. So, it just kind of goes into like the general fund of supplies. And so I think that collaboration and just some frequent meeting, I would love to see fundraising and finance just connecting, even if it's on a monthly basis or every other week basis.
Hmm.
What grants are coming through? What budgets do we need your help with? Regroup. Hey, the final grant award letter, they ended up making it unrestricted, or they honored the application that we wrote, and this is what we're going to have to do. These are the reporting requirements. Blah, blah, blah. Just staying in touch. But I would say how the accounting rules, since you kind of touched on that, I'm just going to say, because I used to be a former auditor too. So say that you are a school and you spend $150,000 a year in program supplies, and largely they're spent with unrestricted fundraising because we don't have a lot of grants that are like specific for supplies.
Yeah.
And if you get a grant that just says, hey, this particular organization only, wants to support consumable supplies. So that falls into our program supply line item. I'm getting kind of technical, but I'm not trying to. Where the accounting rules suggest that if there is clear evidence that we're going to spend 150,000 and you have 10,000 to help support that original budget that we already knew we were going to spend, the accountant is going to be like, why would we go buy something up and above what we
Hmm.
already needed to spend, if that makes sense? Why would
Hmm.
we commit to going and spending? We know we already got a fundraise for the $150,000 worth of supplies we already need to buy. So why are you all writing grants to go buy more stuff? I mean, unless there's a real need for it. But I've seen this where, I've worked with organizations that we're not even raising enough money for our operating needs. And then the CEO, and frankly, it's usually the CEO, or in conjunction with fundraising team, is chasing dollars and like expanding their program in all these different sorts of ways. And I'm like, we're doing what? They're like, oh yeah, we wrote a grant for a new program. I'm like, we don't even have enough money for the programs we have. Like, what are we doing? Why are we not having conversations? We're doing such great work. You can't convince me that a donor with our compelling story wouldn't be willing to support the work that we're already doing. Like, why are we doing this? So that is the frustrating part, I think, on the finance side, that we're writing all these nuanced grants when maybe we can structure them a little bit more in an unrestricted way. Or we're creating more work for us and spreading our team thinner and thinner and thinner, when reality is we should be really kind of staying laser focused, not chasing the dollars. And
You're
when we're not communicating to the finance people, oh, by the way, remember that grant we got a year ago that we spent that $10,000 on 30,000 transactions with Amazon? I'm going to go ahead and need a receipt for every single one of those transactions. That
oh
is
my,
maddening
yeah.
to me. It's like you could have communicated that up front and we could have tracked it along the way and it would have been a lot easier, but now we got to go back. So make sure you're communicating to your team even before I think when the grant's being written, like, hey, this is in the pipeline, just so you know. If you can have that kind of relationship between the fundraising and finance, that everybody understands the pipeline, it's going to go a long way. So that when you get that $10,000 check from Boeing, oh yeah, I remember that grant. We wrote it for this particular program or for certain supplies, whatever.
Well,
So
right,
yeah.
exactly. Why not? And the best when this relationship has worked really well, it's when there has been regular communication about what is happening, usually on a monthly, sometimes on a bi-weekly basis, but monthly for sure, because then there's enough activity, right? Weekly,
Mhm.
it's like, well, we're still waiting, because, guess what? Donors take the time that they want to take to make a decision.
Mhm.
On a monthly basis, talking about, okay, this is what's coming up. This is what we're planning, sharing that information, right? So that the finance person can say, oh, actually, you want to be careful about putting too much for consumable supplies. Can it be a little bit broader? Because we already have that covered, or
Yeah.
we've almost, fulfilled that, blah, blah, blah. So now I can either alter and ask in progress to maybe broaden it a little bit,
Mhm.
or I can potentially go back to that donor. And I've done this had to do this from time to time,
Mhm.
where I can go back to a donor and say, gosh, you know what? There was such an outpouring of support for X
Mhm.
that we would really appreciate if we could reallocate some of your investment to this part of the
Right.
same program.
Right. Right.
Donors,
Pretty agreeable
I have,
usually.
I can think of maybe 3 instances where a donor wasn't into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe three, because they were like super hardcore about wanting to do one particular thing. And well, then, okay, it's, then it becomes sort of this kind of back room. Okay, the finance person, I'm like, hey,
Mhm.
Jane does not
Mhm.
want to do, she wants to pay for X. Now we're going to reallocate, we're going to just have to
Right.
figure out how to reallocate things. It comes down to being willing to communicate regularly and
Mhm.
to share information. When I do a grant, I always try to involve the finance person on the front end of
Mhm.
that grant budget, either because it is well, if it's just for general operating support, the grant maker is just asking for the organizational budget. It's fine. I don't need the finance person to be involved in that because the budget's already created. We all understand it.
Mhm.
It's a
Mhm.
document to attach.
Right.
If it's for a particular program, well, now because I want to present a budget that is realistic,
Mhm.
right? It demonstrates the need in a real way. That's where I'm talking to the finance person saying, we need this budget for this program, for this grant, and this is what the intent of the grant will be. So that person can say, oh, you may want to rethink the ask because we already have that piece, whatever it is, we already have that covered from over here.
Right. Right.
And so we're not going to be able to expend those funds in that way,
Mhm.
right? Or,
And to jump to the other team, I agree with you. Like if you are a fundraising, and this I know, because I actually get a lot of fundraising people that reach out to me like, Tasha, I need a better finance partner. If you are an accountant and you can't offer up suggestions to your development team on where they should be focusing their fundraising efforts, I mean, they just usually understand this is ballpark what I need to fundraise, but if there are gaps in specific programs, if there are gaps in specific line items, like we prioritize professional development, that's not available in any of our funding, and you have a funder that could, or if there's capital improvement needs on a building, like there's certain foundations or whoever that might be specific to that. So you, as the finance person, have an obligation to the organization and to the collaborative relationship with your fundraiser to understand where are the gaps within the organization. And I'll say that because there are times where had I not been super involved with working with my fundraising person, I have a great example where they were writing a tax credit program. It was a fundraising initiative. And the way that they constructed the budget, they were writing it for one specific program, but we already had more than enough funding for that particular program. Meanwhile, we had another program that was a huge, operating at a huge deficit. And we were having to, most of our unrestricted fundraising was going to that. So had I not read it, I'm like, look, you're almost, how do I say this, over allocating or overextending the funding on this one program. Meanwhile, we have this other program. Or, hey, we have a need for a new roof in 2 years, or, whatever it might be. Really
Right.
sharing where those priorities maybe could be, to help find the funders that want to support that, or at least to have more intelligent conversation. And I'll add on to what finance can do for fundraising, giving good data points, like what is like a cost per unit, like building a whole, case statement on what does this look like? What does this investment look like? What is the unit cost, whether it's, it's not that hard to compute. And so if you are a fundraiser working with an accountant that's like, Tasha, I can't even get an organizational budget, much less any of the things that you've talked about, I will validate that's extremely frustrating, and that's not your job to create. And I will say one last thing, I think for, team fundraising, that it's really frustrating when you are charged with this impossible task of going and raising all these grants and they have all restrictions and whatever. I can't tell you how many times I talk with nonprofits that their fundraising team is keeping track of the expenditures for that grant because their accounting team is not equipped, which by the way, is a very basic accounting function for them to be able to track these things. It's more of like a process thing that they need to develop and consistency in that process. There's no reason why your accounting team can't track that. And so the fundraisers are functioning as the fundraisers and some quasi finance team because they can't trust the numbers to report back. And you need to report back for the relationship management of the donor. And so that is incredibly frustrating for fundraising professionals. And I will validate that because that shouldn't have to be the case for sure.
Well, and then to validate team, to validate the frustrations often that team finance have is fundraisers not reporting to them important donor data. So I worked several years ago, I worked for an organization, an arts organization that we discovered that there was upwards of 500, almost $500,000 in uncollectible pledges. Why? And when we reported this to the finance person at the time, he was so mad. And we're like, wait a second, this is not our mess. We discovered this, right? This was years in the making. And it's like, why? And I understand why he was upset, because now he's going to have to figure out how to write all of this down and then report on why is the organization, is there a $500,000 hole now that had been carried year over year over year. Like if fundraisers know if something isn't going to come in, because they're doing the work to try to secure it, to not then go to the finance team and say, hey, look, this gift that we programmed or we were counting on is not going to happen.
Right.
So that it can be accounted for and then explained in a joint way.
Right.
Is unconscionable, right? Because I think because now it has put you in a position of having to be, the bearer of really bad news that was not of your making. And it may not have even been of my making. But this is where I think, the opportunity to create a super team really presents itself, because if I discover that there's like some crazy amount, or even not a crazy amount of uncollectible gifts.
Mhm.
They're just never going to happen, right?
Yeah.
I need to share that with you so that you can account for those things correctly. You can update the financials, we can update the budget, and then we can present a combined reasonable story, right? Of this is how we're accounting for this. This is what it does to the budget. This is what it makes our financials look like. And this is
Mhm.
what we think the solution is.
Yeah. And you bring up some good points. And one of the things that I think going back to like the rules of accounting, or I just call it kind of rules of operation, um, that was frustrating for me in the past as the finance person, how the accounting rules, and a lot of times depending on the fundraiser's goal and how that's measured and, for their personal accountability plan or whatever it might be, the pledges count, right? Pledges count in
Mhm.
the world of
Yeah.
accounting. You never have to collect it, which is kind of what you're alluding to. You never have to collect it necessarily. I mean, ideally you do, but at the time, if you have a good faith, like, or something in writing where we can record the pledge, that counts as revenue on the accounting
Mhm.
side
Right.
and oftentimes in the fundraising side, and that's counted as part of the goal, as it should, right? If you were part of an ask that's $1 million multi-year gift, like obviously you should get credit for that. But where it's been frustrating on the finance side, especially for smaller organizations or social service organizations that don't typically have a lot of reserves or resources, not only am I like trying to just reconcile between fundraising activity or accounting activity and putting a budget together and all these things, but one thing we don't talk about enough is just cash flow, money in the door.
Mhm.
So I'm stressed in figuring out how do we make payroll when my fundraising team is focused on getting pledges or like securing gifts in that way, less focused on collection. And so I used to be hounding them, when are we collecting payment? Well, I don't know. We don't really want to pester the donor about that. I don't know what we got to do, but there's got to be a tactful way of saying, thank you so much for our support. We really want to do some planning around this. We really want to meet these objectives. Could we talk about, the timeline for that, whatever? You could probably speak to this better. But for me, it's like, look, I have to like plan on how we're going to pay people.
Right.
So a pledge that's just recorded in the accounting system and looks great from our finances, is great, but the increments or the timing of when we're going to collect that is a really important piece of information your financial person needs to know. Um,
A- And that is why information like that needs to be shared.
yeah.
We can't not, right? Fundraising does not happen in a vacuum.
Mhm.
Finance does not happen in a vacuum. This is that example. God, that example is so perfect because it illustrates just how wrong it is to have two competing factions. I know, right? If I'm the development director and you're the finance director, I know that cash has to come in the door, right?
Mhm.
To keep the
Right.
lights on, doors open, paying
Sure.
people,
Mhm.
right? So if I don't understand or I haven't been shown what the cash flow projection needs to be, right, as part of the planning process, well, then I
Mhm.
might just be like down, on my merry way, raising money left and right, but it's all pledges that are all going to come in next year. Well, that doesn't
Right.
help, right? I mean,
Doesn't help
yeah,
for
that's
today.
great.
Yeah.
Woo! I've hit my goal, right? I look like a genius. And then 3 months later, we're out of cash and the doors close. Like, who
Right.
cares if I'm a genius? I geniusly raised all of this money. We're telling all of those donors, oh, sorry, we're winding down operation
Right.
and we're not,
We're not going to
either
see it to
or.
next year. Well, and that's
Or
sometimes some of my grievance around hyper focusing on certain elements of fundraising. I know planned giving is a major thing with this big transfer of wealth happening and, building
Mhm.
in endowments or what have you, but it's like, we don't even have enough cash to like get us to this future point. Right. And so how do we
Right.
balance both? Because to your point, if we're getting gifts that are we're counting it as the goal, but meanwhile we have no cash coming in the door. And so I think that that's sometimes a point of confusion for, like you said, understanding the cyclical nature of cash flow and just understanding that, hey, like it is part of the responsibility if you're having conversations with these donors to get some general understanding of like when we can expect to get these gifts and feed that information to your finance team. And then when we don't, get that check in the door, like how do we open that conversation up to donors? And I've seen where fundraising
Right.
professionals can do really, really well. And I have some that, look, I'm not going anywhere near that conversation. It's like, okay, but somebody has to, and you have the relationship. So
Right,
these
exactly.
are
I
all
mean,
great examples. Yeah.
and one of the greatest things to really be able to understand that from a development perspective, I worked in an organization where, we did an annual budget. I was very involved with that. There's a really good process around budgeting. Cash flow was always part of that conversation, right? It wasn't just the
Mhm.
budget. It's like, okay, what on the expense side? The chair of the finance committee, who was he worked in wealth management, was all but had originally started his career as an accountant, as a CPA. He was like, okay, let's project. He was very insistent that we project things out, both on the expense side, which, as you mentioned earlier, pretty typical, right? Pretty
Mhm.
consistent.
Mhm.
Um, and then on the revenue side, okay, let's predict out
Mhm.
when money is coming in. And what we ultimately did was we actually added a third. So we had our financial statements, which were very straightforward, budget, P&L, and uh, one other document. It's like a statement of
Statement.
activities or something. It's
Yeah.
something very common, right? A P&L, very other statement of activities. Those two items. We actually created a third document that was really only for internal use, which broke down, because we were on an accrual system. It broke down what was coming in, what was predicted to come in for the current fiscal year,
Mhm.
and what was predicted to come in for future fiscal years,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And rolled up into that one number. And it was really more for foundations, because all of our individual giving was current. It was very rare that
Mhm.
we were talking with a donor about a multi-year gift. There were a few people, but it was a multi-year gift. Okay, I'm paying 25K this year, 25K next year, 25K the third year. We recorded it as 75, but there was a very clear path
Mhm.
of payments. It was really more around foundations, because that was a big part of our development portfolio, was
Mhm.
foundation grants, and we really wanted to break down what was coming in the current year in cash, because what we were doing, we were actually securing a number of multi-year gifts, which was great for cash flow, right? Because he
Right.
wanted us to kind of smooth cash flow out year over year, rather than have this up and down, up and down. And
Right.
this document it took like took like 6 months to
Mhm.
create, because like all this back and forth about it,
Sure.
but it was incredibly clarifying.
Helpful. Mhm.
And it was something, like I said, we used it internally with the leadership team, but we also shared it with the board, and we talked about it at every single board meeting, so
Mhm.
people could really understand, what do we have coming in that's fueling our operation this year,
Right.
and what do we have coming in the future, so that they could then understand what they needed to be doing in relation to the development process,
Mhm.
to ensure that we had enough funds for current year operations.
Makes sense.
It was a really, even though there were moments where we were so frustrated in like going back and forth about this, it was really incredibly helpful. And to this day, I appreciate that exercise, because it really was this example of where finance and development can work together from their respective
Yeah.
areas for the betterment of the organization. And it really forced people, whether forced or not, maybe that's not the right word, but it gave people a path by
Mhm.
which to understand the finances of an organization and what their responsibilities were
Yeah.
to ensuring that those finances remained healthy.
Yeah, this has been a good conversation around just sharing
Yeah.
ideas for how, and specific examples of how, the two teams could be collaborating much better, much more seamless. And I think we could probably continue this conversation all day. I mean, there's just so many different examples I've learned over my 15 plus years of
Absolutely.
hearing horror stories of, accountants and all the generalization and personality characteristics that we have. And very much seeing black and white and nothing in between. So,
Yeah. Oh,
I've
yeah.
definitely really prided myself on trying to see, the middle ground. So it's also been interesting to hear from you, which it's not surprising because I hear this from so many different fundraising individuals that that it's difficult to get the information you need or processes in place, and especially if you have leadership that's not really spearheading this
Hmm.
this kind of collaboration. So
Right.
Paul, I've so much appreciated this conversation, and I hope that others that are
Absolutely. My
listening
pleasure.
are also finding it useful. You do fundraising consulting, as I mentioned at the beginning. If people wanted to connect with you, whether it's support in their fundraising, how, some of your experience, tips, tricks, hacks, you have so many with all of your experience. What is the best way for people to connect with you?
So I think there's a couple of ways. Of course, they can find me on LinkedIn, and I'll make
Okay.
sure that you have that link. In
Okay.
addition to the work that, they can reach me at Auxilia, where I lead our coaching team, and it's a phenomenal CRM all-in-one platform. But I
Mhm.
also do, other consulting as well, and they can reach me at Paul, so that's P Morris at theauxilia.com is probably the
Okay.
best way to get a hold of me. There at Auxilia, happy to talk about what we do and how we do that. Or then on my own, it's Paul at foundryfundraising.com.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, this
Perfect.
has been so fantastic, Tasha. Thank you
It
so
was
much for
so good to
having me
have you
back.
back. Yeah,
This
it's
was a
always
lot of
fun.
fun. Yeah,
It's always fun to have
very
the
good.
banter back and forth between other departments. And, I love how we can both see
Yeah,
the different sides and like, okay, we get why this is difficult. And I say this a lot with my team, but I've said this so much even before when I worked for a nonprofit, the work is hard enough. Like, why make the people part of it that much harder? And so finding
right.
better ways to work together as a team, we're all after the same goal. So I think
Exactly.
that's never been more
Exactly.
true than this conversation.
Yeah, I
So
couldn't agree more.
thanks again for coming on.
You bet.
And
Thanks so much.
for those that are listening, my shameless plug, engage with this activity in any way if you found this conversation valuable. This is the way that we get the news out. Other nonprofit leaders can find this content the more you engage with it. So whatever you're doing, whether you're listening or you're watching on YouTube or any of the streaming platforms, share it on social media, like it, rate it, whatever it might be. Thank you so much for your support. And until next time, thank you all. Bye. That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tosha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to a Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for a Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.